This is a production of Cornell University.
So good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm Garrick Blaylock. I'm an assistant professor in the department. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the third CE Current Event Seminar Series this year. And I'd like to introduce AIM Senior and AIM Ambassador, Riva Margolis, who is going to introduce our speaker. Riva?
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to today's C-Series on biofuels and climate change. Our speaker today, Professor Antonio Bento, is an expert in environmental and energy economics and has worked on research pertaining to environmental, energy, urban, and public economics. Professor Bento received a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of Maryland in 2000, and prior to joining Cornell, he was a faculty member at the School of Environmental Sciences and Management at the UC Santa Barbara, and more recently at the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. His current work, which he will be discussing today, focuses on the economics of biofuels and the costs and environmental consequences of federal and state ethanol subsidies. Thank you again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Professor Bento.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will be presenting some of the work that my research group is doing in the area of biofuels. As you will see, there will be a lot of colorful pictures. If you don't like them, blame my graduate students, and if you like them, they deserve the credit because they certainly helped me put this presentation together. To start, I want to point out that it's not surprising that this past year we had Nobel Prizes in the area of climate, because it is becoming more and more noticeable that the idea of moving towards sustainable carbon neutral energy is perhaps the most important scientific challenge we face today. And for us to understand the reason why we have pressing pressures to meet the demands for fossil fuels, we need to really look beyond what's happening in the United States and realize that we have a serious population growth happening in developing countries. And so unless we do something to manage the demand for fossil fuels, we are going to get in serious troubles very soon. And so it's important also to understand that there are several reasons that motivate US energy policy in the area of renewable energy and climate change that have to do really with the consequences of this excessive addition on fossil fuels. In fact, if you've seen President Bush a few years ago, he first introduced this term that US economy is addicted to oil. And part of it is because there are several concerns that are associated with this addition. The first one has really to do with the consequences of increased greenhouse gas emissions. But then there are several other concerns that have to do with local air pollution. And as the fossil fuels consumption continues to grow, so does local air pollution, despite the fact of several technological improvements. The third one, perhaps more serious, is really a national security concern, and the concern that more and more the US economy is dependent on oil that comes from political unstable countries. And then finally, a third issue I want to raise is really the issue of supply availability. The idea that US has indeed declined oil production since the 70s. Now, if you don't like these motivations, you will probably appreciate the next picture, and in a sense that this might actually have hurt you recently, which has to do, perhaps one of the reasons why we should be here today is because we have lately experienced serious spikes in fuel prices, and those are obviously associated with fluctuations in the international crude oil price. And to motivate the idea of national security, this picture, which is rather interesting, illustrates the supply of crude oil domestically in yellow, as well as the increase, perhaps excessive increase, of crude oil imports. So as you can see in the picture, in particularly after 1994, we are really becoming more and more dependent on crude oil from other countries, and as I said, countries that perhaps have political unstable regimes, and therefore this could cause serious disruptions in the functioning of our economy. So the question that I want to raise today really is, how will society meet a growing energy demand in a sustainable manner? And this is really the entrance point to talk about biofuels. But really, before I talk about biofuels, I think it's important to recognize that biofuels is going to be one of many options that we can have in front of us to deal with this challenge. And first of all, it is important to recognize, as the pictures that I've so far showed you, that perhaps the problem comes from excessive demand. So any solution to this problem will have really to address the heart of the problem and really develop policies that at the margin will create incentives for consumers like yourself to reduce demand. Now, in the context of transportation sector, for example, this might mean increases in the fuel economy of the vehicles that you purchase, or even at the margin policies that ultimately will hurt you, as you might believe, by raising prices of fuel, but ultimately those policies will contribute to the solution of this problem to the extent that by reducing total driving, they will reduce indeed greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it is important to note that to date, we do not have a federal climate bill. And from my perspective, one of the joys of the recent election is really the fact that President-elect Obama has put forward during the election season a very aggressive climate mitigation program where he calls for a cap-and-trade program that by 2050 will reduce about 80% of the emissions. And more important, and this relates a lot of the work that I've done for the past 6 years, relates with the fact that it's important also to realize that the way we're going to design this cap-and-trade system is such that the allowances that we're going to put in the market are going to be auctioned. And because they are auctioned, they generate revenues. And President-elect Obama has indicated that he plans to earmark the revenues of these auctions to investments in clean energy. A lot of my earlier work suggests that you could do a lot of other things with the revenues of these allowances, including reducing the rate of labor and capital taxes. Now, it is important, before we talk about biofuels, also to recognize the relative contribution of each of the sectors of the economy to greenhouse gas emissions. And not surprisingly, most of my work has focused on the transportation sector because together with electricity, those are the two key contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And it's fair to say that the transportation sector roughly contributes to about 1/3 of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see from this picture, as it turns out, that there is an increasing pressure from the transportation sector as due both to population growth and perhaps to sprawling of America, we are relying more and more in the automobile. And so despite the fact that we have had increases in fuel economy, overall vehicle miles traveled continue to grow, and therefore the contribution of the transportation sector for greenhouse gas emissions continues to grow as well. Now, this has raised, of course, the attention amongst policymakers on how to deal with the transportation sector, and recently the OECD put forward a report that what is important to note is that there's multiple strategies to deal with the emissions from the transportation sector. And the first aspect that I want to highlight here is that this report really points to the heart of the problem, as I was telling you before, which is in order for us to reduce our energy dependence and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, a big push is going to have to come from the demand side. And from the demand side, you can do this either by increasing the average fuel economy of vehicles through legislation that regulates the so-called CAFE standards, or you can increase fuel prices that at that create incentives for individuals to drive less and look for more fuel economy vehicles. So it's not surprising that more than half of the strategy promoted by this report in terms of meeting serious greenhouse gas emissions reductions comes from fuel efficiency. Now, another portion of it is going to come, of course, as automakers move towards plug-in hybrids and hydrogen FCVs, those two might actually end up making up a big portion of the solution. And then we are left with this 17% that the report calls for, which would be the role of biofuels. And so our research group has been trying to study the role of biofuels within the Energy Independence Act. So the Energy Independence Act of 2007 essentially put forward mandates for ethanol, both for corn-based ethanol and for cellulosic ethanol. And this was actually a comprehensive energy legislation that set forward these renewable fuel standards. And the idea really is to reduce US demand for oil by setting a national fuel economy standard, also for passenger vehicles of 35 miles per gallon by 2020, combined with mandates for biofuels. And so how is this implemented? The EPA will take charge of the implementation of the mandate, and this is a regulation that will be applied directly to refineries and blenders and importers. And perhaps the important thing to remind here is that by 2022, the US economy is expected to produce about 36 billion gallons of ethanol. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very large target, and the issue is how are we going to get there? And the second issue is, as students of public policy and economics, does this make sense? Is it the most cost-effective way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Now, to give you a little bit more idea of the energy bill and how it breaks down the different types of ethanol that it puts forward, it really puts forward three targets here. First of all, conventional biofuels. And conventional biofuels are essentially ethanol derived from corn. And the energy bill sets forward the sustainability criteria that basically states that corn-based ethanol must achieve a 20% greenhouse gas emissions reduction compared to the baseline life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially, if you would replace a gallon of regular gasoline by a gallon of blended fuel that would include corn-based ethanol, this criteria essentially tells you that you ought to meet a 20% greenhouse gas emissions reduction. If you have been following the popular press, this is really a point of contention. There's been articles in Science that claim that this is possible during 2006 and 2007. And more recently, there is an article that has caught a lot of attention, which I will talk in a second, that essentially states that this is impossible because for you to meet 15 billion gallon of ethanol coming for corn, you're going to have to realize that agricultural producers will start adjusting, and as land use changes occur, perhaps this 20% greenhouse gas emissions savings will start failing, in part because as you create more pressure on land to produce corn, perhaps land use change starts to occur both in the US and elsewhere, and this might actually lead to an exacerbation of greenhouse gas emissions. So a very interesting aspect of this research has really to do with the potential unintended consequences of these mandates. Now, perhaps even more hard to meet because we currently don't have technologies in the market that are profitable or for which you could convince any investor to invest funds on it would be on cellulosic. And so it is interesting that the energy bill puts forward a mandate that starts binding around 2015 and grows very fast by 2022, that essentially mandates the US economy of producing another 15 billion gallons from cellulosic biofuels. And those are expected to achieve much larger greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I will talk a little bit about the biological process that leads to these reductions. This is essentially because you're going to rely on perennial grasses as opposed to corn, and given the properties of the grasses, it is likely that you would generate these larger greenhouse gas emissions reductions from a life cycle perspective. But again, once you start realizing that whenever you put grasses or crops in land, agents adjust, perhaps some of these greenhouse gas emission savings would very quickly evaporate as well. So this is really a contentious point and one of interest. So here are some of the pictures that we've put together to try to entertain you a little bit. This is the first generation of biofuels from corn and soybean, and the second generation from switchgrass, wheat straw, hybrid poplar, and other forms of biomass. The reason why I've put switchgrass is because at Cornell, in the plant breeding department, we are actually conducting trials for switchgrasses throughout the state, because if you are interested to learn something about this, it's not very easy to grow switchgrasses. There is a tremendous amount of investment up front in terms of seed costs, and it takes up to 3 years for the land owner to actually see the results of his investment. And so there are problems with the implementation of a market for switchgrass that have to do with the fact that not only in today's prices is not cost competitive, but then there are a lot of practical issues in terms of how do we get farmers engaged in the production of switchgrasses. And so Cornell Cooperative Extension is really doing a lot of work in terms of linking plant breeders with farmers and disseminating education materials to engage people in the production of switchgrasses. Now, I want also to stress that ethanol is really not a good idea. It's not a new idea in a sense that has been around since the 80s, and perhaps we should think why it has never picked up. I'm not going to sound too much negative right up front, but you know, there is a reason why it has not picked up throughout the 80s and the 90s, and this has to do with the fact that historically it has not been competitive against regular gasoline. And you will start seeing the spikes starting in 2000, precisely at the point where the tax credits for ethanol are put in place, where effectively the government subsidizes the expansion of this sector. Now, I want, again, to stress the mandates in the law, because those strike me as very strict mandates that, that we ought to meet. And so as you can see, the blue one denotes the mandate up till 2015 of corn-based ethanol. It grows rather fast and then it plateaus. And it plateaus at about 15 billion gallons because it is the belief of the USDA that given what we know about agricultural practices, some USDA researchers believe that it's possible to accommodate within the US landscape these additional 15 billion gallons of ethanol from corn, especially if we look at the historical gains that we've seen in yields for corn over time. And then slowly, and up till 2022, the rest of the target will be met by these advanced biofuel standards, which essentially call for the production of cellulosic ethanol. And so, such that by 2022, we will have a total of 36 billion gallons. So the question then is whether biofuels is part of the answer. And in recent articles in Science, a lot of authors are starting to wonder whether this is really the answer, or whether this could actually exacerbate potentially food supply problems and ultimately create food hunger in developing countries, in part because if we start dedicating land in the US for the production of corn that then feeds into ethanol, perhaps we're going to start causing land use changes elsewhere, and furthermore, perhaps we're going to start having spikes in food prices. And so this is really a point in the literature that is up for debate. And just to give you an idea of the level of these agreements, we see newspaper articles claiming that the impact of biofuels on food prices ranges from 10 to 50%. So I'm going to try to give you my sense on the interpretations of those results, but more than anything, I will actually challenge you to read the news and get acquainted to this topic, because it's really a challenging topic and a fascinating one. And so now I'm going to show you, so that you understand, in my opinion, how exciting this debate is, a variety of different quotes, some very enthusiastic and some rather nasty in terms of the role of biofuels. And I would actually even say that a lot of these quotes reflect even the position on this topic amongst different researchers at Cornell and elsewhere. So it's really important that you appreciate that there is a tremendous amount of disagreement amongst policymakers, amongst academics on the topic. And so here is a quote from FAO's Director General, and he says, "Biofuels present both opportunities and risks. The outcome would depend on the specific context of the country and the policies adopted." So this is neither positive or negative, but perhaps this one is more interesting. Food versus fuel, Texas versus EPA. It showed up in the popular press around August. The EPA said in a statement that while commodity prices have risen, an analysis of Texas requests found no compelling evidence that the mandate is causing severe economic harm. So in other words, the EPA is putting forward a statement that perhaps the rising in commodity prices that we are seeing might not be at all linked with biofuel mandates. This one comes from the UN Environmental Program and says, "There was an unfortunate effort to dress up biofuels as a silver bullet of climate change." This is interesting because when we started the debate on biofuels, there was really a belief that biofuels might constitute a big portion of the solution to the climate crisis, particularly for the transportation sector. And there now is the recognition that that might not be the case. We fully believe that if biofuels are to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, there is urgently needs to be better sustainable criteria. So this speaks to the sustainable criteria that we put forward to evaluate biofuels, in part because there is disagreement amongst the scientific community as whether there are greenhouse gas emission savings from corn-based ethanol and what are the extent of greenhouse gas emission savings from cellulosic ethanol. This one, which my colleague on campus, Professor Pimentel, who I debated a week ago in the law school, always shows to everybody, so I borrowed from his presentation. Essentially, John Ziensler, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, has condemned the growing use of crops to produce biofuels as a replacement for petrol as a crime against humanity. So this illustrates how contentious this debate is, and what we are trying to do in AIM with our research group is really just put some structure in this debate by developing a model of the US economy that illustrates how the different agents behave in response to the mandates to try to get at some of these issues. One of the issues is really that determines whether there are greenhouse gas emission savings or not has to do with the fact that if you impose these strict mandates, you might believe that there are additional land use changes that come from the intensification of agriculture and expansion of cultivated lands. And so there was a recent paper in Science by Tim Serginger from Princeton, and basically he says that essentially, and if you talk to him, all the literature up till his paper has been completely incorrect because it neglected land use impacts. He is a very eloquent fellow. and a fascinating person, and he was part of a recent scope assessments for the United Nations, and basically is really pressing to the point that perhaps there are unintended consequences of biofuel mandates on land use that could occur in countries that perhaps have the greatest potential to store carbon. And so in his assessment, he concludes that as a consequence of US biofuel mandates, you could have generated land use change in Brazil that ultimately will exacerbate greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really interesting. This gentleman from Nature Conservancy essentially states that you need to really be more careful when you look at these land use impacts, because perhaps if you put certain dedicated energy crops on marginal lands, you could actually increase the overall levels of carbon sequestration, and so on and so forth. I could spend the rest of my lecture showing you these quotes and really convincing you that there is a lot of debate. But what I want to do now is really give you a snapshot of what we are doing in AIM, and try to get you excited for some of the research that our group does. We have undergraduate students involved in the research, and so if this opens your eye and interest, feel free to contact me afterwards, and we will have some work for you. This is a never-ending project. What we are trying to do here is really very carefully to measure the impacts of these increased mandates on agricultural production, land use change, fuel use, and then speak precisely to the point on whether there are greenhouse gas emission savings from increased biofuel productions or not. This is a nice picture that one of our graduate students put together that describes our model. Our model is what economists call a computable general equilibrium model, which is essentially a bunch of equations that characterize the behavior of the agents affected by policies. But this picture attempts to give you an idea of who these agents are. So on the top up there, you see cropland rotation and tillage, and this really reflects the behavior of our agricultural producer, who is endowed with land and essentially allocates the land to maximize the returns by choosing amongst the major crops. And so the crops that the model considers is corn, soybeans, wheat, and hay. And below that, you see rotation and tillage. If you talk with colleagues in crops and soils, they will tell you that the way you do agricultural practices and the way you mix the crops over the years in certain rotations might be more or less beneficial to the soil. So we consider both the rotations and the tillages. And then from there, as you can see, you produce energy crops, you produce crops that will go into the food sector. And then down here, you have the ethanol sector that absorbs a large portion of these crops that are produced, and then together with gasoline generates a blended fuel that feeds into VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled. And then our consumer essentially decides how much to drive, the fuel economy of the vehicles, and the amount of food. And this system, it's really nice because it allows you to capture all the greenhouse gas emissions that are generated throughout these processes, as well as potential trade-offs that you could have as you expand the ethanol sector that feedbacks into how agricultural producers behave, and again, feedbacks in resulting food prices. So essentially, you have a way to handle most of the contentious questions that I showed you in the codes. So now I want to talk a little bit about the agricultural land use impacts. And this table is a summary of some of our preliminary simulations. And we start with the base year of 2003. And then we're going to increase the mandate every year up till 2015. Right now, we are primarily examining the corn-based ethanol mandate, which, as I told you, requires a production of 15 billion gallons of ethanol by 2015. And so the first thing I want to point is that in 2003, you see that you have a base acreage of 77.53 million acres of land allocated to corn. And so the question is, as you increase the mandate, you're obviously going to have an increase in corn production and the acreage dedicated to corn. So that goes up 4.85 million acres. And then the question really is, where is this acreage coming from? And what are the consequences? Oops. What are the consequences of that? And so where is the acreage coming from? It's coming from, in the short run, to meet the 2008 mandates, 65% of that acreage comes from soybeans. So it's likely that you'd start experience reductions in soybeans and wheat. And here CRP means land that is in the Conservation Reserve Program. The USDA essentially compensates farmers to set aside land for conservation purposes. And this is important because there's a lot of environmental benefits that come out of this program. And so one of the things that you see from this last row is that in order to meet the mandates for corn-based ethanol, you're going to start experience a conversion of land that was in the Conservation Reserve Program. In fact, our model predicts, roughly speaking, an increase, a conversion of about 5.8. So 5.8% of the land that you need to increase to meet the corn mandate is going to come from this Conservation Reserve Program. This is rather important because perhaps this table starts immediately to highlight that while you could meet the mandates, what could happen is that you might exacerbate other goals that other agencies have established. And one of the goals is really to create incentives for farmers to use sustainable practices and to really set aside land for conservation so that over time they continue to retain the maximum benefits in the soil. So what you see is really a large expansion of land in CRP, and if you talk with ecologists, this is really a big deal. Now, the next table, what I want to tell you a little bit about is that for those of you concerned with water pollution problems, my colleague from ecology and evolutionary biology has really been studying the impacts of biofuel mandates on water pollution, and most of those impacts occur because in response to the mandates, our agricultural producers might actually intensify the way they use land. And in particularly what this table suggests is that to meet the 2008 mandates, you're going to increase the share of corn that is in continuous corn rotations. This is very important. Essentially what it means is that when you're doing your farm decisions, you can combine corn with soybeans, you can combine corn with soybeans and wheat, or if you want to get more corn, you start replacing these rotations with rotations that essentially have corn after corn after corn. Of course, as you do these, you create pressure for potential increases in water pollution that are associated with the input usage that you have to have in order to sustain these continuous corn rotations. Now, as you can see, in the long run, in 2015, this pressure will be even greater. Right? So the point so far is that from an agricultural point of view, even before looking at the impacts of the mandates on land use in other countries, we need to realize that in the US we could have some serious problems. We have some serious problems because we might be converting land that the USDA has established as desirable for Conservation Reserve Program, or we could be creating incentives for farmers to really move towards more intense agricultural practices. Now, having said that, and the reason why I'm putting this slide was I was part of this SCOPE United Nations assessment on rapid assessment on biofuels, and one of the things that I enjoyed the most of serving in that panel was to listen to some of the colleagues, in particularly from India, and one of the excitements for those colleagues in terms of biofuels was the potential impact of biofuel policies on farm income. And this is important because, when you put these policies in place, you could have goals such as reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but some other agents in the economy might believe that these policies could actually also be beneficial to increase farm income and promote rural development. And so what do you see in this slide? And by the way, the model allows for endogenous and exogenous adjustments on a variety of dimensions, particularly on pesticide and fertilizer prices, which whip off some of these gains. But the bottom line is that these mandates for corn-based ethanol really transfer a lot of money to the agricultural sector. And so what you can see there is that there is a tremendous increase in land rents between 2008 and 2003, about a 44% increase, and an even larger increase by 2015. I'm not even sure yet whether our team has gotten that number right, because it's really a substantial increase. And you should realize that this is a policy that really is helping the agricultural sector, at least crop producers. It might be hurting others because the livestock sector might actually start to feel the higher prices of some of these feedstocks. And so one should very carefully examine the distributional impacts of these policies. But I think the bottom line here is that if one of the goals of these policies is promote rural development and increase farm income, they are certainly doing part of the job. For you to understand where those improvements come from, this table shows you the changes in prices for the major crops, and the one which we are somewhat underestimating, but it's moving in the right direction, is really the price of corn. So if you've been following fluctuations in corn prices, you've seen that corn prices have really spiked, and that's precisely what the model predicts. The model predicts by 2015, you will have 123% appreciation in corn prices. And it's also important to realize that because you're putting more pressure on land, not only corn prices will increase, but in fact the prices of every single crop will increase. Now, we have been incredibly careful, and our model also allows that over time yields for each of the different crops could grow. So in other words, while you are putting pressure on land, there is a way to produce more supply of crops, essentially because the yields might increase over time. But nonetheless, what this suggests is that even with yield increases, you're still going to experience a substantial increase in prices. So impacts on food. This is an interesting slide because, as I told you, one of the largest concerns is really whether biofuels is causing a problem in the food sector. And so I think we have to be a little careful when we examine this issue. And so here I want to make statements by isolating the potential gains that you get by allowing yields to grow over time. So the first point I want to make is that in the most naive model, where you set up a mandate and you look at what's happening to the food sector, what you will see is that by 2015, indeed, you really created a huge reduction of the corn used in the food sector, and this is essentially because you don't allow yields to grow, and you don't really deal with the co-products of ethanol. But the point that I want to make is that while indeed in the most naive case you're going to have a huge reduction in corn used by the food sector, one of the things that happens with ethanol production is that you generate a variety of co-products that you could use as feed for livestock. And so part of that reduction is compensated by increases in sector as co-products, and therefore the effective corn reduction in food sector is only 17%. So the issue then is whether you believe that this is a big deal or not, and what is the potential impact of this reduction on overall food prices. Now, the other thing I want to note is actually down here, which is what's happening to the other crops. So what's happening to the other crops is that if you believe the projections of the USDA in terms of exogenous yields increases over time, by 2015, you end up in the last column, where essentially you really did not disrupt by that much the US market for the major crops. So what you see is that you're going to have an effective reduction of corn used in food by about 18%, but because you compensate that with co-products, the effective reduction is only 4.87%. But because you also let yields adjust for all the other crops, you could actually end up with somewhat increases in overall soybean and wheat and very marginal reductions in hay. So the point I want to make here is, before we jump very fast to conclusions that these mandates on biofuels are going to disrupt international markets for crops and therefore create pressure for land conversion elsewhere, we really need to understand very carefully this issue of how yield grows over time and land expansion for each of these crops varies before we really make statements about what's happening in the rest of the world. And I should point out that I started conversations with Tim Serginger, the author that published that paper in Science that really point out for these land use effects, and it turns out that in that model you didn't have these yield adjustments. And so it's really hard that if you don't have yield adjustments and if you don't model US land in the Conservation Reserve Program, that if you want to expand your cultivated area, you're going to do it in the US, and therefore you're going to essentially reduce the amount of corn that you send elsewhere, and therefore you're going to put the pressure in other countries. So, I don't want to make a definite statement on this issue, but what I would like to say is that there is a reason why the USDA set a mandate at 15 billion gallons for corn-based ethanol and not a much larger mandate. And I personally believe that the reason it was precisely because there was a clear belief amongst USDA economists that if you take their projections on yield increases, it might be likely that you could actually accommodate this production in the US without disrupting international markets, and therefore perhaps some of the results that you see in the Serginger paper may not occur. Now, I'm not saying that we are not experiencing deforestation in Brazil. I think we are, and if you look at high-resolution spatial data, you will observe that that's happening. But you could also claim that that's happening not only because of US biofuel mandates, and perhaps not because of US biofuel mandates, but because actually of pressures that are created within the Brazilian economy combined with infrastructure policies in order to create markets that essentially create pressure for conversion of land that should not be converted. Now, what is interesting about this research, and this is something that none of the literature has captured so far, and there is also a reason why they have not captured, is because most of the models that have examined this question came from the tradition of agricultural economics, and therefore studied primarily the effects that happen in terms of agricultural production and the distributional impacts within the sectors of agriculture. But it turns out that if we are talking about a fuel mandate, we really need a much more comprehensive model that links the transportation sector with the agricultural sector. And how am I going to say this? If you think you're going to get past biofuel mandates and not feel anything in your driving patterns, be careful, because the bad news that I have for you is that biofuel mandates are a tax on gasoline that someone else decided to call it a mandate. And so perhaps we don't have gasoline taxes in this country because there is a lot of political opposition. But the bottom line is that when you impose mandates on biofuels, essentially you're telling the blender, you have to, in your production of the blended fuel, you're going to have to use a certain quantity of ethanol. And there's only one way for the blender to meet that mandate, which is to increase the price of the blended fuel. And so the minute that happens, what we're going to start seeing is increases in fuel prices. And as a consequence, there might be a lot of interesting things that biofuels policies end up doing in the transportation sector that may make up for the increases in greenhouse gas emissions that we generated in agriculture. So this table highlights some of that point. So first thing I want to highlight here is that in 2003, as you can see, the share of blended fuel that comes from ethanol is ridiculously small. Only 2% is the 2.75 billion gallons. And as you increase this share with the mandate, what happens is that by increasing the price of the blended fuel, you're going to get a reduction of about 1.38% of overall blended fuel. And this happens in part because you're replacing regular gasoline by ethanol, but because by raising the overall price of fuel, you're actually reducing the overall consumption of blended fuel. Now, this is interesting because if it behaves like a fuel tax, it definitely creates you incentives for driving less, which is what I mean by consumer demand adjustments, and for searching for fuel economy options. So one of the things that might happen in response to the increased mandate is that if indeed fuel prices go up, overall vehicle miles traveled will reduce, and some agents will search for more fuel-efficient vehicles. Now, if that is the case, I can create situations where the mandate essentially reduces overall blended fuel consumption by actually a rather large amount, 6.96%. And now the point I want to make, which is, I think, rather interesting, is that if you believe one of the first pictures that I showed you, which was the transportation sector, is a much larger contributed to greenhouse gas emissions than the agricultural sector, perhaps a 6.696 reduction in blended fuel in the transportation sector is going to dominate the bad things that are happening in your agricultural sector. Okay? So if your concern was, regardless of costs, are biofuels reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Probably they are. But as an economist, what I think, and as students of public policy, what we need to ask ourselves is the following. Could have we arrived at that same result with other policies without disrupting the agricultural sector and therefore achieving the same level of greenhouse gas emissions at much lower cost? And perhaps the answer is yes. And so a lot of the work that I've done prior to looking at biofuel policies was precisely look at the effects of increases in federal gasoline taxes. And as you can imagine, what would happen in the context here would be if you would increase the federal gasoline tax, and it turns out that it would only be required a 20 cents increase, you could generate a very similar effect, but you would not be getting the exacerbation of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Now, I'm not saying that if you would do that, you would not have any biofuels in the economy. I'm just saying that if you would do that, you would have the optimal amount of biofuels in the economy because you would not be mandating biofuels. Biofuels will emerge if they are part of a competitive package to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So what I said a week ago when I was debating Professor Pimentel, who is a vivid voice against biofuels, is that I don't want to be labeled pro-ethanol because I'm neither pro nor against. What I am is someone who's trying to do a quantitative assessment of alternative instruments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. I'm able to tell you what are the most direct instruments to get the targets reductions that you get at minimum cost. And as you do that exercise, if biofuels are part of the package, they will show up naturally. By mandating biofuels, on the other hand, you could be promoting an excessive production and an expansion of a sector that, if you would not subsidize, would not exist in the economy. And I think that's a very important point. Okay. So this gives you an idea of the impacts on prices, on the transportation when you put these mandates in place. And as I try to highlight, essentially the mechanism works in a very simple fashion. You mandate blenders for the production of a blended fuel for which they have to use a targeted amount of ethanol. And so as a consequence, the price of blended fuel goes up, and goes up in part because the price of ethanol goes up over time. And why is the price of ethanol increasing over time? Essentially because for the agricultural market to clear, crop prices have to go up, and therefore the ethanol price will go up. And so as you can see, you're going to end up with a serious increase in blended fuel, about 70.78%. And so the question, which I think it's more of a how do we convince American society that if we have an energy crisis and if we have a serious problem of global warming, perhaps we have to think about policies that reduce the overall demand and therefore create incentives to search for cleaner technologies. You know, we could do that with policies that look directly at the fuel markets. We don't need to go around in all these different obscure systems of mandates that basically create these effects in a lot of prices in the economy that could essentially generate undesirable distributional impacts. And so here, the only number that I want you to pay attention is the total changes in the efficiency cost. So this is $5.33 billion. This is the cost of meeting the mandate in 2008 that our model predicts. And it predicts that to meet the mandate in 2015, it will cost you $20 billion. Okay, so these are actually a rather large number by 2015, in my opinion. And the bottom line is that our preliminary simulations start to suggest that you could get the exact same savings with only a 20 cents increase in the federal gasoline tax. So former Vice President Al Gore was one of the first to advocate for a comprehensive carbon tax and increases in fuel taxes, and there is a reason why that's the most efficient instrument to get us there. Now, emissions impacts. I think this summarizes a lot of what I've been trying to say, which is in response to the mandates, you're going to have two types of effects. The bottom effects are in the agricultural sector, and they actually mimic rather closely the effects that you see from other studies, and essentially point to the fact that you're going to experience an overall increase in emissions from agriculture. But I think the point I want you to take home is that if you look at the baseline emissions in agricultural versus transportation, the contribution of agriculture is so small that whether you're increasing emissions in agriculture is not really the heart of the issue here. The point is that what you want is to drastically reduce the emissions from transportation. Okay? Now, with the mandate, you can do that, and in fact, you create incentives for increases in fuel economy, for overall reductions in miles traveled, but you could, once again, and I really want to stress this point, you could have arrived at very similar effects had you just decided to go for a policy instrument that would target the transportation sector directly. Okay? So in conclusions, what I wanted to do today is to just give you an overview of the research that we are putting together with our research team on climate and biofuels, and give you a little bit of a flavor of what I believe the next administration is going to do. And by the way, not surprisingly, if indeed we have a comprehensive federal program for climate mitigation, all these sectoral policies, including biofuel policies, start to make less and less sense because, if what you're trying to address is overall greenhouse gas emissions, you should do it through a comprehensive package that essentially forces the sectors that are more capable of reducing emissions at lower costs to be the first ones to reduce those emissions. I wanted to give you a flavor of the kinds of work that we do. And so what our group does is really spend a lot of time building these models to attempt to contribute to these public policy debates. And I try to do that by showing you all these quotes that you see in the popular press. If I was a student, again, I think I would be completely confused because every day there is a different person writing in the Wall Street or in New York Times, etc., with a different point of view on this topic. And so what we try to do here is to step back and really don't let our preconceived opinions on the issue dominate our minds and actually model these processes as careful as we can. And so when we do that, I think there's two key conclusions that come out of this exercise so far. The first one is that when you put this mandate in place, indeed you can create potential unintended consequences in the agricultural sector. And there are two channels that drive those consequences. First of all, the potential conversion of land that is in the Conservation Reserve Program, as well as a potential for the intensification of the agricultural production. And so therefore, these two effects combined could indeed exacerbate agricultural pollution. Not only would they increase the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, but they could put at risk a lot of other goals that the federal government has set in terms of conserving land and in terms of reducing water pollution. The other effect that comes out of this research, which is interesting, is that perhaps the mandates indeed generate savings in fuel use, because by raising the prices of blended fuels, they will contribute to an overall reduction in vehicle miles traveled and increase in fuel economy. But as I tried to stress, you could have arrived there a lot cheaper with other instruments. And then finally, if you are pushing for biofuels with the argument of rural development, it's true that landowners' income is growing. It's growing by a large portion, but you should also realize that the livestock sector might actually be adversely affected. And so the bottom line is that there's going to be serious winners and serious losers here. I think in terms of the food sector, we are still really studying very carefully the treatment of the co-products. And so our model right now predicts rather small impacts on food prices, but it could be that there's something funny going on in the model. So I politely say that further analysis is needed. And so instead of saying that it's 10 or 50, I rather not state a number just yet. And so, and then the other question, which I leave it open, is whether we believe that by setting these targets by 2015, whether indeed we're going to cause land use changes elsewhere. And I try to convince you that in order for you to answer that, you really need a very careful model that allows not only for land expansion in the overall cropland, but also accounts for yield expansion that might occur over time. And to the extent that yield gains might mitigate some of the pressure that you put in the land, perhaps a lot of the unintended consequences that others have found that US policies might cause in developing countries, perhaps they do not exist, or if they exist, perhaps they are not at the same magnitude as others have pointed. So I would conclude here, and I would open the floor for questions. Yes?
How many of these models and the mandates do you feel are dependent on oil being above $60 a barrel?
Okay, so what we do, that's a very good question, because the price of crude oil in part determines, as we do the runs, whether without any mandate, you should have an ethanol sector in the US economy or not. So not surprisingly, if you're very careful, what you do is you take the historic fluctuations in the crude oil prices, and then you do a lot of sensitivity analysis where you vary the price of crude oil and therefore the price of regular gasoline, and you resolve the model over and over again. And as a consequence, the size of the ethanol sector shrinks or expands, and so does the cost of meeting the mandates.
So at
So
oil price right now, do you feel like a lot of these are going to be pushed through?
So what's happening was that we've experienced a large increase in crude oil prices, but lately they started to go down. And when they go down, combined with an increase in corn prices, what you'll probably start seeing is that some of the corn-based ethanol plants are running out of profit. And so if you guys are following the popular press, there's several, I think 2 or 3 corn-based ethanol plants that just filed bankruptcy. And this is precisely because if you lower the price of crude oil, and if you don't adjust the tax credit that is given in order for the ethanol to be produced and still be competitive, essentially you run that facility out of business. And also because the number of facilities is growing, that puts a lot of pressure to meet the amount of corn that is needed to supply these facilities. And so with increases in corn prices, the minute you start seeing reductions in crude price oil, what could happen is bankruptcy of a lot of these facilities. And so as a consequence, an economist from Purdue has suggested that you should have variable tax credits for ethanol that essentially would vary with the fluctuation in crude oil prices. Essentially because once you put an investment into place, if you are so vulnerable to these fluctuations, you could some years gain a lot, others lose a lot. Does that make sense? Any other question?
Maybe we can take some questions in the reception, which will follow immediately, but perhaps you could conclude by, if students wanted to pursue this topic, are there any classes you'd recommend they take?
Okay.
And maybe after you mentioned that, Reba, if you could conclude the seminar, please.
Okay, so we do this in 2 ways. We have 3 undergraduate students, 2 of them who are in the Presidential Scholars Program that work with us. And the hope is that for the students who are interested in research in these areas, we facilitate the transition for things like potential honors thesis. And there is so many things that you can do with these classes of models that if any of you is interested, I would really encourage you to contact us. So that's more on the research side. On the teaching side, in the spring, we offer a seminar on biofuels that's really going to give you an overview of all these issues. And the way we accomplish that is instead of having me teaching every single lecture, we have a sequence of speakers. So you're going to have speakers from plant breeding that are going to tell you everything that you ever wanted to know about switchgrasses. And then you're going to have others running you through these life cycle models, and then some of us running you through these economic models. So I would encourage you, if you are interested, to sign up for that course. And even if you don't want to take the course for credit, the colloquium is open to everybody, and so everybody should feel welcome to participate.